Autumn Page Strickland was racing down the street, gasping for breath. Behind her, her own car was chasing her, and at the wheel sat a stranger. Who was he? What did he want? Thoughts whirled through her mind, but no answers came, and there was no time to find them. She had to save her life. Surveillance cameras captured Autumn's desperate attempt to escape, and what detectives later found on those recordings allowed them to reconstruct the events of that night of sheer terror and to solve the case. What had begun as a missing person case soon turned into an inexplicable story of murder by a stranger, involving a car chase and an attempt to destroy all the evidence in flames. Autumn Page Strickland was born and raised in Florida, where her love for the outdoors first began. She enjoyed fishing, boating, horseback riding, swimming, and sunbathing. During her college years, Autumn moved to Alabama. She earned a degree in advertising at the University of Alabama, where she also met her future husband, Jeffrey Strickland. The couple married on January 2, 2007, when Autumn was 20 and Jeffrey was 22. That same year, Autumn began working as a property manager in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, overseeing more than 200 real estate properties. In addition, she sold personal training contracts at a fitness center. Autumn worked tirelessly, and despite her young age, she managed to achieve significant success in her career. In 2012, Autumn Page Strickland became the mother of a wonderful baby boy whom she and Jeffrey named Lane. Unfortunately, the couple soon realized they were not right for each other and separated, but both parents adored their son. Autumn was a loving and devoted mother, spending all her free time with him. They went to the beach, played active games, visited the zoo. Autumn did everything she could to fill her son's childhood with happy memories. She never imagined that all too soon those moments would become her most precious memories of him. In mid-April 2017, Lane was rushed to the emergency room. The prognosis was grim. Doctors discovered rhabdomyosarcoma in the 4-year-old's brain. They told Autumn and Jeffrey that this was a rare form of cancer, affecting fewer than 350 people per year. The parents were devastated. It was every parent's worst nightmare. For Autumn, the news was especially shocking, as Lane had always seemed like a healthy, happy child. How could a mother possibly expect something like this when her son was only 4? To make matters worse, their insurance company fought them over covering each medication their son needed, many of which cost more than $550 per week. Friends rallied to help by organizing fundraisers for Lane. Soon, he began both chemotherapy and radiation treatments. Autumn shared a photo of her son in the hospital. He had already lost his beautiful wheat blonde hair and wore a medical mask, but he was surrounded by love. Autumn admitted, "We fight every day, and sometimes it's harder than I'll ever admit to anyone. But I know that without him, there is no me." Like many parents in such a situation, Autumn watched helplessly as her little boy grew weaker, undergoing one procedure after another, clinging to the hope that something might change. But the cancer proved too overwhelming for such a small child. On July 22, 2017, just days before his 5th birthday, Lane passed away, only 2.5 months after the terrible diagnosis. By some miracle, Autumn Page Strickland managed to pull herself together after the loss of her son. She was deeply supported by friends and family who tried to draw the grieving mother out of her home, distract her, and help her regain some sense of normalcy in her life. Autumn herself understood that nothing could bring Lane back and that she had to keep moving forward, but doing so was far harder than simply saying it. She continued to share photos of Lane, often writing beneath them, "Not a minute goes by that I don't miss you. I hate living this life without you." To occupy herself, Autumn threw herself into work. She worked as a realtor and client relations manager. And in 2018, she even launched her own clothing line, named in honor of her son. Soon, Jason Linsman entered Autumn's life, and in 2023, she once again became a mother. This time to Aspen Olivia, an incredibly beautiful little girl. Aspen Olivia had her mother's eyes and bore a striking resemblance to Lane. To Autumn, she became her entire world. But at some point, Autumn and her daughter's father went their separate ways. By 2025, the 38-year-old Autumn was living with her daughter in Florence, Alabama, where she had been renting a house for 2 years and working alongside her mother at a real estate agency. She was planning to move back to her home state of Florida soon, but until then, she kept herself busy with work, though she still made time to meet up with friends whenever her mother could watch her granddaughter. However, one night changed everything. On May 16, 2025, Autumn had made plans to spend time with friends. It was a Friday evening, and she checked into the Strickland Hotel in downtown Florence. the same city where she lived, because she and her friends had decided to meet at the hotel's bar. That's where the group spent a wonderful evening together. They left the bar at around 1:50 a.m. and walked toward their cars, which were parked near the hotel. Autumn also needed to head to her car, and afterward, she likely would have driven home to her daughter, who was staying with her mother that night, but Autumn never made it. She disappeared. After that night, her friends and family were unable to reach her. Of course, she couldn't have just dropped everything and run away. She would never have abandoned her beloved daughter. Worry quickly grew, and early on Sunday, May 18th, when Autumn still hadn't appeared, she was officially reported missing. Her friends took to social media, sharing where Autumn had last been seen and what she was wearing. Denim shorts, a black tank top, and flip-flops. But no one had spotted her, despite the fact that she vanished in the middle of downtown, an area often filled with University of Alabama students, since the campus is nearby and the district is full of bars, restaurants, and other popular spots to spend time. Since police knew exactly where Autumn had last been seen, they began reviewing surveillance footage. They spotted her on video just before 2 a.m. on May 17th, leaving the Strickland Hotel with her friends. She was wearing the same clothes her friends later described when she was reported missing. After saying goodbye, Autumn walked toward the parking lot where her car was parked. But the next camera police obtained captured a chilling scene. Autumn was running down the street near the hotel, clutching her phone in her hand. She was sprinting as if someone were chasing her, and indeed, moments later, headlights emerged from the darkness behind her. A car was following directly after her. Investigators were stunned to realize that the vehicle pursuing Autumn was her own car, a green 2012 Kia Soul. The car did not slow down. It struck Autumn, knocking her to the ground. Then the driver turned the vehicle around and ran over her a second time, as if to make sure the injuries were fatal. After that, the driver fled the scene in Autumn's car, leaving her motionless body on the road. The incident bore no resemblance to an accidental hit and run. It was the deliberate murder of Autumn Strickland. Detectives quickly examined the scene of the crime. They discovered Autumn's phone on the sidewalk. Her Kia Soul was later found abandoned about 2 kilometers from where she had been struck. If the perpetrator had killed her, ditched the car, and stopped there, he might never have been caught. But it seemed his plan for Autumn's nightmare that night wasn't over. The same camera captured what happened next. About half an hour later, another vehicle approached the victim's body, which still lay on the sidewalk. It was a white pickup truck. The truck stopped beside her. A tall, dark-haired man stepped out, lifted Autumn, dead or dying, placed her in the truck, and drove away. By Tuesday, May 20th, investigators had gathered enough evidence to identify and locate a potential suspect. He turned out to be a local resident, 28-year-old Logan Michael Rogers. Early that morning, police obtained an arrest warrant and went to his home. He lived just 6 minutes from the hotel where Autumn had met her friends. Parked outside his house was the very same white pickup truck that investigators had seen on the surveillance footage. Since Autumn had not yet been found, Rogers was initially charged with attempted murder, and his bond was set at $1 million. A search of his home followed. The house appeared neglected, as if it had been abandoned for a long time. But the most horrifying discovery was not inside the house, but on the property. A burn barrel, showing clear signs of a recent fire. The blaze had been used to destroy a human body. It still needed to be officially confirmed that the remains belonged to Autumn, but everyone already knew what the answer would be. Logan had not only run over his victim twice with her own car, but had also burned her body. Neighbors were shocked. The thought that a young woman had been incinerated in a barrel just a few yards from their homes was almost too much to comprehend. As soon as Logan's name and photo became public, people began asking who he was and what connection he had to Autumn. How did he end up in her car? Why did he run her over? There was speculation that the two had been a couple, but Autumn's friends were quick to insist she had never dated him. In fact, they had never even seen this man before. Many in Florence knew Logan and his family, and those who were acquainted with him were stunned to learn that he had been arrested in connection with such a horrific crime. People remembered him as a high school football star. Back then, he was very popular, often written about in local newspapers for his athletic achievements. Unsurprisingly, he was also popular with girls. In 2016, Logan met the woman who would later become his wife. After their wedding, she gave birth to their son in 2023. Logan also ran his own business, offering lawn care, landscaping, and groundskeeping services. On the surface, he appeared to be a successful man. He should have been enjoying life, not attacking a stranger. So why did he commit murder? Because the image of a successful businessman, happy father, and devoted husband was just that, an image. In reality, Logan had changed drastically in recent years, and the reason lay partly in his use of illicit substances. They had destroyed the lives of many good people before him, and Logan too had become their victim. Logan was first arrested for marijuana possession at the age of 20. He later claimed he didn't actually have any on him, but he still served 3 years in prison. At 27, he got caught again when a patrol officer discovered cannabis in his possession during a traffic stop. In 2023, around the time his son was supposed to be born, Logan was arrested for public intoxication, and at that time his wife had obtained a restraining order against him. But Logan didn't reform, quite the opposite. In January 2025, he was arrested again in connection with domestic violence. He had threatened his parents, Teresa and Mike, saying he would kill them. Both his mother and wife subsequently obtained restraining orders. Teresa admitted she was genuinely afraid of her son because even the smallest provocation could set him off. If his own parents were not safe, who could be? Certainly not Autumn, but Logan had begun hunting for victims even before Autumn. He prowled the area near the University of Alabama in Florence, seeking attractive young women he could approach and, using various tricks, convince to go home with him. 3 weeks before Autumn's murder, in roughly the same area where she would later be run over, Logan tried to lure another young woman into his schemes, Trinity Bradley, a student at the University of North Alabama. Trinity had spent the evening with friends and, while returning to her dorm, encountered Logan, whom she initially assumed was a student. He pulled up in his white pickup truck, slightly rolled down the window, and asked if he could use her phone. He explained that he was running out of gas and only needed to make a single call. Trinity willingly approached the truck to hand him the phone. But as soon as she did, Logan revealed that he had only stopped because he found her attractive. He wanted her to give him her phone number. Feeling uncomfortable, Trinity politely refused and tried to walk away, not expecting what would happen next. Logan got out of the truck, approached her from behind, and grabbed her with both arms. Fortunately, Trinity managed to free herself but panicked. The stranger had clearly crossed a line. She hurried up the stairs to her dorm, with Logan following closely behind. Trinity cleverly hid her phone under her waistband and secretly began recording him. Meanwhile, Logan was spouting some unconvincing nonsense. He claimed he wanted to show her something. He asked her to come to his house just to sit and talk, saying he wanted to show her everything he knew. Naturally, she refused. She didn't even know who he was. Trinity took a few steps up the stairs and told him to stop harassing women in that way. He replied that it was just a hug. Luckily, he then left her alone. However, the encounter unnerved Trinity enough that she reported him to campus police. Officers were unable to locate him that night. He had likely already left. After speaking with a campus officer, Trinity decided not to press charges, hoping he would continue to be monitored. She assumed he had experienced a temporary lapse in judgment and chose to move on. 3 weeks later, she saw his face in the news in connection with the murder of a young woman in the same area where he had harassed her. It was clear that Logan's crimes were escalating until the irreversible occurred. He had gone on the hunt, and he didn't care who the victim would be. After all, he didn't know Autumn any more than he had known Trinity. It is still unclear exactly what happened in the parking lot when Autumn approached her car. Logan obviously could not have been waiting for her there, since he didn't know her and therefore didn't know which car she drove. But it can be assumed that something similar to what happened with Trinity occurred. He may have noticed her, waited until she was alone, and tried to convince her to give him a ride home. He didn't shy away from tricks like running out of gas or needing to use someone's phone. Perhaps Autumn believed him, or perhaps she refused. But this time he was far more determined. He attacked her, took her car keys, caught up with her, and ran her over twice. Then he began doing things that defy logic. Logan left the victim lying on the ground, but fled in her car. He abandoned the stolen vehicle and found a way to return home, possibly calling someone for a ride or asking online if anyone would give him a lift for money, as he had done before. In any case, he went home, grabbed his pickup truck, and returned to the crime scene about half an hour later. It was the middle of the night, yet surprisingly, no one found the body, despite the fact that it was downtown, an area frequently populated by students and cars. Nevertheless, under the cover of night, Logan placed the girl in his pickup and drove home. He then lit a fire in a burn barrel and disposed of the body. One can only hope she was already dead at that point and that he did not burn her alive. Most likely, Logan's intent was a savage attempt to destroy evidence. Ironically, he only made the police's job easier by appearing on surveillance footage in his white pickup truck. The day after his arrest and the search, May 21, 2025, Logan appeared in court. The prosecutor requested that he not be released on bail, and the judge agreed. Logan is currently in jail awaiting trial. The prosecution is considering seeking the maximum penalty. In Alabama, prosecutors can request the death penalty if a murder is committed under aggravating circumstances, such as kidnapping or during the commission of another crime, like robbery. Thus, if Logan is found guilty, which seems highly likely, he will either spend the rest of his life in prison or be sentenced to death. Another tragic aspect of this case is that at the time of the attack on Autumn, Logan was already awaiting trial for threats against his parents. The judge likely understood that Logan's criminal behavior was escalating, but still allowed him to be released on bail. Had the judge decided to keep him in jail, Autumn might still be alive today, and her daughter would not have lost her mother. Unfortunately, in this case, there are far too many what-ifs. What if the judge had not released him on bail? What if Trinity had pressed charges? What if Autumn had returned to Florida a little earlier? Everything could have turned out differently. Because Logan had been popular with girls in school, he was used to getting what he wanted. He felt like a hero on the football field, surrounded by beautiful girls dreaming of going to prom with him. Combined with his narcissistic personality and drug use, it was a recipe for disaster. Logan believed that women owed him something. One evening, he decided he had the right to hunt them down. It didn't matter who the victim would be. He had no specific target, just a brutal, senseless attack on a girl who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Paris, 9 p.m., December 31st, 2000. The buildings glow with bright lights, and the streets are packed with thousands of Parisians and visitors preparing to count down the final minutes to midnight. Music, laughter, and joy echo from every direction. It's a night of celebration, but not for everyone. What was supposed to be a dream has become the worst night of Jeanette's life. She's exhausted, freezing, weighed down by a heavy backpack, barely speaks French, and it's starting to feel like she's missed her last chance to find warmth and safety. In her pocket is a plane ticket that won't take her home for 2 more days. Suddenly, a stranger steps out of the faceless crowd. His friendly face and warm smile offer hope. He offers help. But what if the hand reaching out belongs to a predator? On the morning of January 2nd, 2001, 2 12-year-old boys, cousins living in the Paris suburb of Les Mureaux, in a housing complex with the romantic name City of Musicians, went out for a walk with their dog. The dog was off-leash as she usually came running when called, but that day she didn't respond. Instead, she ran toward an abandoned, trash-strewn parking lot. Something had caught her attention. The boys followed her and found her sniffing intently at a sleeping bag. Curious, they picked up a stick and gently poked it. It was clearly not empty. They thought maybe a homeless person was sleeping inside. But why wasn't he reacting? One of the boys suggested calling his father. The man reluctantly came to check, assuming the boys were just playing around. But when he approached the sleeping bag and loosened the drawstring, he saw the body of a person lying face down. Blood and long hair were immediately visible. A cord from the sleeping bag was wrapped tightly around the victim's neck. The man called the police right away. Inside the sleeping bag was the body of a young woman. She was lying face down in a strange, unnatural position. She wore a t-shirt, sweatpants, and an oversized button-down shirt, likely a man's. There were no documents or personal belongings that could help identify her. The marks on her neck and the blows to her head left no doubt this was a violent death. Police attempted to identify the victim by showing her photo to residents in the area, but no one recognized her. Reviewing surveillance cameras brought no results either. One thing, however, was certain. The crime hadn't taken place in the parking lot where the body was found. Both the sleeping bag and the body were completely dry, despite the fact that it had rained on December 31st, January 1st, and 2nd. The victim had clearly been dumped there, but likely not from a moving car. This wasn't the kind of area with heavy traffic. The autopsy revealed that the victim had suffered 13 blows to the head with a blunt object, followed by strangulation, twice. First manually, then with a cord or something similar. However, it wasn't the drawstring from the sleeping bag. It was too thin for that. Her liver had ruptured but showed no signs of bleeding, indicating that the injury occurred post-mortem. Toxicology results confirmed she had not consumed drugs or alcohol. She had not been sexually assaulted. At the time of death, she was menstruating and had been using a tampon. Forensic experts found hairs inside the sleeping bag that did not belong to the victim, and beneath her fingernails, traces of skin, likely from the killer. While police in France were working to identify the victim, thousands of kilometers away, in the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, the O'Keefe family was growing increasingly worried about their daughter and sister. Kevin and Susan O'Keefe hadn't heard from their daughter, Jeanette, in 3 days. After spending 2 months in Paris, Jeanette was scheduled to fly to New York on January 2nd to visit a friend and her sister, both living in the U.S. But that day, her friend in New York called Jeanette's sister, Denise, confused. Jeanette never arrived. Why hadn't she called if she'd missed her flight? Concerned, Denise phoned their mother, but she had no idea either. The hostel where Jeanette had been staying offered no answers. Desperate, her mother contacted local Australian authorities, who in turn reached out to the French police. The moment the investigator working on the case of the young woman found in a sleeping bag saw the description of 28-year-old Jeanette O'Keefe, he knew they had identified the victim. But to be certain, detectives headed to the hostel where Jeanette had been staying. There, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. Jeanette had been a shy and reserved woman who barely interacted with other students. Only 3 people at the hostel thought they might recognize her, and even they weren't completely sure. Meanwhile, back in Australia, when police officers pulled up to the O'Keefe family's home, Jeanette's father instantly sensed what they were about to say. The officers told the grieving parents that their daughter, beaten and strangled, had been found stuffed inside a sleeping bag on the outskirts of Paris. Kevin and Susan O'Keefe were overwhelmed. Kevin couldn't stop replaying the moment of his daughter's death in his mind. He broke down in tears. But they had to gather the strength to share the devastating news with their other children, Denise, Christine, and Craig. None of them could believe it. Jeanette was always so cautious, steering clear of bad influences and reckless decisions. How could she end up dead 40 kilometers from the French capital? The family was convinced there had been a mistake. Jeanette's sister, Denise, flew to France. But once she arrived at the morgue, there was no doubt. The last time Denise saw her sister was that summer at her wedding in the United States. Shortly afterward, Jeanette set off on a trip across Europe, deciding to spend a few extra months in her favorite city, Paris. Jeanette was a little naive, but she was also incredibly bright and talented. She had a deep passion for music and the history of ancient civilizations. Still, she was shy, painfully so, and that made her quiet, often keeping to herself. During the few months she spent living in Paris, Jeanette made very few friends. Police were trying to understand how the young woman ended up in Les Mureaux, so far from where she was staying in Paris. The last confirmed sighting of her was on December 31st, when she checked out of the hostel, returning her keys and leaving with all her belongings, a heavy backpack on her shoulders and a bag in hand. After that, her trail went cold. Since Jeanette hadn't shared her plans with the other students, detectives quickly hit a dead end. However, they did uncover one lead. Jeanette had been attending French language courses. At the language school, police were fortunate to find someone who knew Jeanette, a man named Anthony Martin. Anthony, 40 years old and originally from New Zealand, had come to Paris after a painful divorce. He was hoping to clear his mind, visit his sister, and improve his French. Anthony met Jeanette through their language teacher, who had asked him to talk to her. The instructor explained that Jeanette was lonely in a foreign country, barely knew anyone in Paris, and her extreme shyness made it difficult to make friends. They met up a few times, shared coffee, and explored the city together. Then, on December 31st around 7 p.m., Jeanette called Anthony in a panic. She told him she was supposed to meet her friend Elise for New Year's Eve and stay at her place until her flight back to the U.S. on January 2nd. But Elise never showed up. Jeanette didn't know what to do. Maybe she was short on money, or maybe she hadn't planned for a last-minute hotel on New Year's Eve in Paris. She asked Anthony if she could stay with him for a night or two. He agreed, and they arranged to meet near a restaurant on the Champs-Élysées at around 8:30 or 9 p.m., but Anthony was running late. By the time he arrived, Jeanette was already gone. He waited for 20 minutes until around 10:30 p.m. before finally leaving. He spent the rest of the night walking alone through the city, glowing with lights and celebration, unaware that it would be the last night anyone ever saw Jeanette alive. The fact that Anthony spent New Year's Eve wandering the city alone meant he had no alibi. He quickly became the prime suspect. Police searched his apartment but found nothing of interest. However, Anthony had sent a curious email to Jeanette's mother, Susan. In it, he explained that he had missed Jeanette on December 31st because he had a meeting in the suburbs and got stuck in traffic. But he never mentioned that meeting to investigators. And when police traced his phone activity from that evening, they uncovered a surprising twist. Anthony had lied to both the police and Susan. His phone pinged near the Champs-Élysées restaurant at 8:45 p.m., meaning he had already arrived at the meeting point. When confronted, Anthony admitted the truth. He had deliberately been late. He insisted he wasn't a killer. A week earlier, he had invited Jeanette to spend Christmas with him. He went out of his way, spent money on a special dinner, only for her to cancel at the last moment, saying she felt unwell. Then, 3 days later, she stood him up again, this time leaving him waiting in the cold for 45 minutes. He felt she had treated him poorly, twice. And there was one more reason he didn't want her staying at his place again. She had once spent the night at his apartment before. Anthony gave her the bed and slept on the floor, despite suffering from back pain. He wasn't keen on repeating the experience. After his confession, Anthony was released. There was no physical evidence linking him to a crime. Still, authorities didn't rule him out. For 2 months, he remained under investigation, barred from leaving the country while waiting for DNA results. When the samples came back negative, Anthony was finally cleared. Relieved, he went home, but he'd forever carry the weight of knowing that Jeanette might still be alive, had he simply shown up that night. But how could he have known what was about to happen? However, Anthony gave the police an important lead. Until then, investigators did not know that Jeanette was supposed to meet Elise. Elise was her neighbor. She had placed an ad in the newspaper looking for an English tutor. Jeanette responded to the ad, the girls began lessons, and soon became friends. Elise invited her friend to spend New Year's Eve with her and her friends instead of staying home alone. Jeanette agreed. Elise also offered for Jeanette to stay at her place until January 2nd, the day of her flight to the US again. Jeanette agreed. The girls arranged to meet on the evening of December 31st at the Mairie de Clichy metro station. This spot was suggested by Elise. She drove to the metro by car, knowing that Jeanette had a heavy backpack. She waited for an hour, but Jeanette never showed up. According to Jeanette, it was Elise who never arrived. Police suspect that, being unfamiliar with the city, Jeanette confused the Mairie de Clichy station with Place de Clichy, or simply got off at the wrong stop. In a panic, since Elise wasn't there, Jeanette found a payphone and called Anthony. Meanwhile, Elise had returned home and called the hostel where Jeanette was staying. She left a message, but by then, Jeanette had packed her things, returned the room keys, and left. In the end, Elise had no choice but to go celebrate New Year's with her friends. Meanwhile, poor Jeanette was already unable to meet 2 of her friends on New Year's Eve, but the series of missed meetings was far from over. The festive night turned into a nightmare for Jeanette. She was alone in a crowd in a strange city. She had a heavy backpack, was cold, probably hungry, and didn't know where to spend the night. She was desperate. It felt as though all her friends had abandoned her, but she managed to think of calling one person who might help her. At 9 o'clock in the evening, she called Elise's mother. Elise's parents offered to shelter her until January 2nd. The woman struggled to explain to Jeanette how to get to their home by public transport. The problem was that she didn't speak English, and Jeanette hadn't yet learned enough French to understand everything she was told. But the women agreed that Jeanette would call her friend's parents as soon as she arrived at the station, and they would pick her up by car. But the girl never called. In fact, she wouldn't have been able to. In the morning, Elise's mother discovered that she had hung up the phone incorrectly, so no one could have reached her. What do the police believe happened that night? Jeanette needed to travel 25 kilometers from Paris to the station where Elise's parents would pick her up. She had to find the right line and not get confused when the line split into 2 branches. Detectives concluded that the girl got lost. The police posted her photo in the metro, but no one saw Jeanette that evening. She wasn't even captured on surveillance cameras, as if she didn't exist. They checked hostels and the lost and found office because she had a laptop, a camera, and a backpack, but nothing was found with her. Most likely at some point that night, the girl met her killer. Lost, cold, and tired, she might have followed the wrong person. Since the girl ultimately ended up in the residential neighborhood known as the City of Musicians, the police assumed that someone from the local residents, men living alone, had brought Jeanette home. The police sent them summonses to appear and provide DNA samples, but many simply ignored the police's request. People in that area were not very willing to cooperate with law enforcement. Moreover, the police had no legal right to force a suspect to submit DNA samples unless the person had already been convicted of a serious crime. Detectives continued sending summonses, but they were completely ignored. 2 years passed this way until another high-profile case further slowed down the police work. On January 9, 2003, 9-year-old Estelle Mouzin disappeared on her way home from school. All available resources were thrown into the search to increase the chances of finding her alive and unharmed. The search lasted several weeks. The case was only solved in the summer of 2020. The kidnapper turned out to be Michel Fourniret. one of the most brutal serial killers in France's history. Years passed. 5, 6, 7 years went by, but the murder of the Australian woman remained a mystery. Then suddenly, in April 2008, a new crime occurred in the Paris area that had many similarities to Jeanette's murder. The body of 19-year-old Swedish student Susanna Zetterberg was found in the Chantilly forest after she had spent the evening at a club with friends. Like Jeanette, she was a foreigner who had come to Paris to study French. She also disappeared one night in Paris after being alone for a short time. But in this case, a lead was found faster. Susanna got into a taxi. Thanks to surveillance cameras, the taxi driver who had given Susanna a ride was quickly found. He turned out to be the rapist Bruno Chalier. He confessed to Susanna's murder. The police hurried to check if Chalier had worked on December 31, 2000, the night Jeanette disappeared. After all, Jeanette could have taken a taxi to avoid carrying her heavy backpack. Their answer was disappointing. They had to exclude Chalier from the list of suspects because on the night of December 31, 2000, he was in prison. But the police did not lose hope. By 2008, the National DNA Database of all criminals, Fichier National Automatisé des Empreintes Génétiques, already contained 900,000 samples. On February 2, 2009, detectives were notified of a match. The DNA found under Jeanette's nails belonged to 34-year-old Adriano Araujo da Silva. His data had been entered into the FNAEG system in February 2008. He had been driving without a license, and when stopped by the police, he decided it was wiser to try to run over an officer than just pay the fine. He spent a month in jail, his DNA was added to the database, and now it matched the DNA from Jeanette's case. Adriano was already known to the police as a resident of the City of Musicians neighborhood. He had been summoned several times to provide DNA samples, but never showed up. However, it would be wrong to think that luck smiled on the police. Otherwise, the officers would never have found the suspect. Although officers cannot force suspects to provide DNA, the police have the ability to collect biological material left outside the body. For example, they might offer a suspect a glass of water and then collect saliva samples from the glass, or find a cigarette butt thrown into a trash bin by the suspect. Although this was an incredibly hard and painstaking task, the police managed to obtain 114 out of 120 DNA samples from men living alone in that residential area by one method or another. Only 6 remained, and they would have inevitably found Adriano anyway, who would have been the last on their list. What did they find out about Adriano Araujo da Silva? Adriano was born in Brazil. His mother was a young girl who had an affair with a married man. The man's wife gave birth to a son around the same time as the mistress. However, the mistress did not tell the man about Adriano, and the boy grew up away from his parents on a farm for 5 years. Later, she finally decided to inform the lover about Adriano. The man took the boy from the farm, forged Brazilian documents for Adriano, and presented him as the twin brother of the son born to his lawful wife. Then the man separated from his wife and moved to French Guiana with his son. Although he initially developed some paternal feelings, taking care of the boy was difficult for him. The boy practically lived on the streets of the city, fed by the mother of his friend Pauline. Finally, Pauline asked the boy's father for permission to officially adopt him. The father was only glad to get rid of his son. In 1998, now a grown man and a French citizen, Adriano came to France without any problems. He had only completed 4 years of school, but was strong, which helped him get a job in a freight transportation company. Adriano changed many jobs, tried to start a small repair services business, but ended up unemployed again. However, he was popular with women. By 2009, he had 3 children from 2 women, but lived with neither of them. He lived with his new girlfriend, Joan. Detectives spoke with 2 previous girlfriends and learned that Adriano could be simply charming, kind, sensitive, gentle, and tender. But in an instant, he could lose his temper due to jealousy and beat his girlfriends badly. Moreover, he sincerely believed he was punishing them because they deserved it. Adriano was arrested on February 17, 2009. A search of his apartment yielded nothing, and Adriano calmly stated that he had heard about the murder and received summonses but did not appear because he was not involved. He claimed there was a laboratory error and that the DNA was not his. The detectives patiently explained to him that the DNA was a serious issue and that he needed to provide an explanation. Then Adriano said he had seen Jeanette on the evening of December 31st in Le Moreau when some young men attacked her. He rushed to help her, but since she was scared, she mistook him for one of the attackers and scratched him. The police, of course, did not believe this story. Investigators received new results from the laboratory. The DNA from hairs found in a sleeping bag, which could not be analyzed 8 years earlier, also belonged to Adriano. He faced up to 30 years in prison for the murder, but could be released earlier on parole if he started cooperating with the investigation. He needed to explain himself, and he understood that. Finally, he promised to tell everything, but first wanted to talk to his girlfriend Joan. It seemed Adriano needed forgiveness from the only person he loved. The police reluctantly agreed. Adriano called Joan, told her he loved her, apologized, and said he would go to prison because he had killed a girl. He asked Joan to wait for him. After that, Adriano confessed to Jeanette's murder, or rather, he told his version of the events of that night. He said he was walking along the Champs-Élysées in the center of Paris when he noticed Jeanette. They talked, and she explained the situation she was in. Adriano offered her to spend the night at his place. She agreed. As soon as they got to his home, they made love. Adriano wanted to repeat this pleasant experience, but Jeanette was against it. She said no and wanted to leave. In response, Adriano hit her with an iron rod. Jeanette started screaming, and Adriano had to silence her at any cost. He sat on top of her, wrapped his arms around her neck, and the louder she screamed, the harder he strangled her until she lost consciousness. Then he wrapped an extension cord around her neck and continued strangling. Soon Jeanette was dead. After spending several hours next to the body, he decided to get rid of it. Adriano dressed Jeanette in his clothes, put her in a sleeping bag, and simply threw it out the window. This also explained why the victim's liver was damaged but not bleeding. Then Adriano realized that the body lying under his window would lead the police directly to him. So he went down and dragged the sleeping bag to the parking lot, where it was later found by some boys. The police accepted his confession, although they were sure it was not the whole truth. According to the medical examiner, Jeanette had not engaged in intimate relations before her death because she was menstruating and using a tampon. But part of the story was probably true. The killer met Jeanette in the very heart of Paris. Although it was assumed she was going to her friend Elise's parents, it is possible she changed her mind or was just about to do so when Adriano noticed her. Lonely, cold, desperate, she certainly stood out against the crowd celebrating the new year, and the gaze of a predator like Adriano could not fail to notice her. As his former girlfriend said, he could seem kind and gentle, and it was easy for him to convince Jeanette that he wished her well. They went to his home, where Adriano started to make advances. She explained that he should not expect intimacy. Any other guy would have accepted the refusal calmly. But, as a psychologist later explained, Adriano always had difficulty communicating with girls and not thinking that they might leave him. This fear had haunted him since childhood. And when Jeanette refused and pushed him away, it became a catalyst that made him attack her. The trial began on January 3, 2012. Jeanette's sisters and brother attended the court, but her parents were unable to come to France due to poor health. They all hoped that Adriano would show respect for the deceased, apologize, and tell the whole truth. These hopes were not fulfilled. The man declared he was innocent and claimed his confession was coerced. Now he stated that after making love with Jeanette at his home, they had an argument and he kicked her out. Therefore, she must have met her killer after leaving him. Knowing that no one would believe his story and that his fate was practically sealed, he should have shown more respect to the family of the deceased, but instead he caused them even more pain. On the last day of the trial, he delivered a shocking monologue, claiming he met Jeanette in a subway car where she seduced him and that they made love right there in the train's bathroom. He shared details worthy of an adult film using vulgar language. Even his lawyer was horrified. In the end, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but could have been eligible for parole after 20 years. The man did not accept the verdict. He appealed but only succeeded in having the parole possibility revoked. He will be 63 years old when he sees freedom again. A series of misfortunes and overwhelming bad luck, that's how one could describe the last hours of Jeanette O'Keeffe's life before her worst nightmare, the encounter with her killer. A young woman full of hopes and plans was crushed by the city she loved. The streets she once walked with a beating heart became the place where she took her last steps, alone and very vulnerable. An ideal victim for a predator's keen gaze. Living and studying in the capital of France, Paris, is a dream for many. But while some only dream, 19-year-old Swedish girl Susanna Zetterberg, known to everyone as Sanna, was not afraid to turn her dream into reality. Convincing her parents to let her improve her French at the Sorbonne, Paris-Sorbonne University, she moved into a small studio apartment in Montmartre, staying with the aunt of her close friend. Sanna not only studied but also earned money for her personal expenses. At first, she worked as a nanny, looking after children, and later found a part-time job at a cafe in Galerie Lafayette, one of the most famous shopping centers in France. On Friday evening, April 18, 2008, Sana was out with her close friends who had traveled from Stockholm specifically to spend the weekend with her. The girls went to the La Scala nightclub on Rue de Rivoli. They had a great time and drank a little. Around 4:30 a.m., Sana told her friends that she had to work on Saturday and needed to go home. However, her friends weren't ready to end the night just yet. Sana reassured them that she would be fine getting home alone. "I'll already be asleep when you get back," she confidently stated, and that was that. The girls stayed at the club while Susanna headed home. Around 5 a.m., Susanna's friends decided it was time to leave as well. They took a taxi and returned to the studio apartment where she lived. The place was only a 10-minute drive from the club, so they arrived, certain that Sana would already be asleep. Imagine their shock when they found the apartment empty. They immediately tried calling her mobile phone, but their calls went straight to voicemail. On Saturday, April 19, 2008, around noon, a woman was walking her dog in the Chantilly forest, 40 kilometers from Paris. Near a bench on the side of the trail, she noticed something that made her step closer. As she approached, she was horrified to realize it was a body. The woman quickly contacted the police. The police arrived at the crime scene at 12:40 p.m. They examined the victim, a young woman, no older than 20. She lay face down, her hands cuffed behind her back, and her legs bent at a 90-degree angle. The handcuffs were not standard police restraints, but appeared to be from an adult store. The body was partially burned, with severe damage to the shoulders, back, pelvis, and upper legs. However, the fire had spared parts of her clothing, allowing investigators to determine that she had been wearing jeans, a jacket, and a scarf or bandana around her neck. Her shoes were missing. A bullet wound was visible near her ear. When officers turned her over, they were surprised to see that her face had not been affected by the fire. It was covered in dirt and leaves, and a hematoma was visible on her forehead. Despite this, it was clear that she had been strikingly beautiful, with blue eyes and light hair that created a haunting contrast against the gruesome scene. It was an image the police would never forget. They couldn't stop imagining the suffering this poor girl had endured before being abandoned in the forest, left out in the open, without even an attempt to conceal her body. Because the killer, or killers, had made no effort to hide the body, leaving it so close to the road, investigators initially speculated that the victim could have been a sex worker. In that world, such an overtly staged murder might serve as a message or a warning. Near the body, officers found 2.22 caliber shell casings lying on the ground, with a third casing directly beneath the victim. The murder weapon appeared to be missing, likely taken by the killer. The police also found no personal belongings near the victim. There was no purse, no ID, nothing that could help identify who this young woman was. The police quickly set up a road patrol on the road located about 10 meters from the bench where the body was found. This was a frequently used road that ran through the Chantilly forest, with many people driving the same route daily on their way to and from work. The police hoped that some of these regular commuters might have noticed something unusual. They questioned the owners of more than 500 vehicles, and their efforts paid off. At around 6:45 a.m. on Saturday, two women on their way to work saw a fire. One of them became alarmed, fearing it could turn into a forest fire. She pulled over and called the fire department. The firefighters asked if the fire was large. The woman replied that a mannequin was burning. They then asked if she had anything to put it out. Fortunately, the woman was a veterinarian and had a bottle of water in her car for animals. She poured the water on the mannequin, successfully extinguishing the flames. Satisfied with her good deed, she drove away, completely unaware that, thanks to her actions, the victim's body had not been completely burned. At 6:25 a.m. on the same day, another man was driving through the Chantilly forest on his way to work. He noticed a car and was quite surprised. For many years, he had been driving through the forest daily and had never seen a vehicle in that spot. In the middle of the woods, what was it doing there? It didn't seem like a breakdown. The witness remembered that it was a white minivan with tinted windows. The police attached great importance to this testimony since the witness had seen the minivan within the time frame when the crime had occurred. Detectives were almost certain that the man had seen the killer's vehicle. In addition to the motorist, several morning joggers also contacted the police. It turned out that they too had seen the body near the bench, but just like the veterinary student, for some reason they also mistook it for a mannequin. The very next day, on Sunday, April 20th, the forensic pathologist performed the autopsy. He determined that the victim had died several hours before being discovered at noon. His conclusion was that the cause of death was a powerful blow to the chest, with something very sharp, such as an ice pick. The weapon pierced the lung, causing severe bleeding, which led to asphyxiation. The forensic expert also found 4 bullet wounds at the back of the victim's skull. However, the wounds on the head barely bled, indicating that all 4 bullets were fired when the victim was already in agony and either dying or dead. In other words, the killer wanted to make absolutely sure that she was dead. One significant detail was that there was no smoke in the victim's lungs, meaning she hadn't inhaled it. This suggested that the killer set her on fire after she had died, and he had focused his efforts on her intimate areas. As a result, the forensic expert was unable to determine whether the killer had sexually assaulted the victim. However, one thing was certain: the cruelty the killer displayed toward her, even after her death, was undeniable. Toxicological tests revealed that there was alcohol in the victim's system, but not enough to dull her senses, nor to numb the pain and suffering she had endured. On Monday, April 21st, just 2 days after the body was discovered in the Chantilly forest, the Swedish consul contacted the police. He had heard about the body in the news and immediately connected it to the disappearance of a Swedish citizen who had gone missing on the night between Friday and Saturday. He sent the police the most recent photograph of the girl, taken on the very evening she disappeared. The photo was taken in a car, showing beautiful, smiling girls. The detective working on the murder case immediately recognized the red thin scarf found on the victim. He saw her stunning blue eyes, her angelic face, and realized that they had identified the poor girl who had been so brutally treated in the forest. Her name was Susanna Zetterberg. She was 19 years old. She was a student and lived in a small studio apartment in Montmartre, which belonged to her friend's aunt. When Susanna didn't return on Saturday morning, the woman who owned the apartment immediately became worried. She knew Susanna very well and knew that she was a responsible girl who wouldn't skip work, even though she had been out at the club the night before. Since she couldn't get in touch with Susanna by phone, the woman quickly went to the police. But as often happens, the police didn't take the girl's disappearance seriously. The woman insisted that it was completely out of character for Susanna to disappear like this. Moreover, it was unheard of for a 19-year-old girl to have her phone turned off for such a long period. However, feeling that the police were not taking the search seriously, the woman contacted the Swedish consul in Paris. He, in turn, contacted the police captain directly. It was now clear that the victim was Susanna Zetterberg. Since she had gone missing from Paris, the Paris police took over the case. They were also tasked with the difficult job of informing Susanna's family of her death. Upon hearing about her daughter's death, Susanna's mother became severely distressed. She never expected that something like this could happen to her daughter, that she could be abducted in the very heart of Paris. Standing by the woman's bedside, the police officers gently described what had happened to Susanna and promised to find the perpetrator. The investigators began examining Susanna's bank cards and quickly discovered that someone had attempted to withdraw money from her accounts in the immediate vicinity of where her body was found. This was clearly not Susanna, but a man. He had done everything possible to hide his face from the cameras. He wore a cap, glasses, pulled the collar of his sweater over his face, and used a latex glove to enter the PIN code. He withdrew money from several ATMs. At 6:02 a.m., he withdrew 100 euros, and at 6:59 a.m., he withdrew another 200 euros. This undoubtedly pointed to the fact that he was at least involved in her abduction and murder. At the same time, the police examined Susanna's phone and realized that the student's troubles began as soon as she left the nightclub. She had told her friends that she would take a taxi home. Indeed, at 4:30 a.m., Susanna got into a car. The trip from the La Scala nightclub near the Louvre to her studio apartment in Montmartre should have taken no more than 10 minutes. However, according to her phone records, 20 minutes later, she was moving in the opposite direction from her home. The phone connected to the cell tower several more times at 4:51, 4:56, 5:02, and 5:13, each time further away from the city center. After that, the phone stopped working and the girl disappeared. Clearly, there was a connection between the route she was taking and the taxi driver she had gotten into. This assumption was confirmed by Susanna's friends. When she was on her way home, they called her to say that they were getting into a car and would be arriving shortly after her. In response, Susanna said in Swedish that she was in a strange taxi. She didn't explain what was strange about it, but judging by her voice, she didn't seem particularly worried, so her friends didn't think much of it until it was too late. Investigators conducted a large-scale survey among the city's taxi drivers, asking who had worked in the area near Rue de Rivoli on the night from Friday to Saturday. One of the drivers reported that around 4:30 a.m., when Susanna was likely preparing to return home, He too was waiting for a passenger near the La Scala nightclub. A young woman approached him and asked if he was available. She spoke with an accent, and the driver thought she might have had a bit to drink. He replied that he was waiting for a passenger. Then, the driver noticed a white minivan pull up and park nearby. This detail immediately caught the investigators' attention because it was the same kind of vehicle a witness had seen in the Chantilly forest. The taxi driver went on to say that, after a while, the minivan drove off, and he no longer saw the girl. This led to the assumption that Susanna, if it was indeed her, may have gotten into the white minivan. However, the most interesting detail the witness added was that it wasn't a legitimate taxi. The driver was working illegally. Illegal taxis don't have official markings, and they typically look for passengers near clubs and concert halls in the evening. At that time, there were around 150 such illegal taxis operating in the capital. As the case attracted a great deal of attention, it allowed the police to receive a wealth of additional crucial testimonies. In particular, a young woman came to the station and shared her story. She worked at a restaurant near Rue de Rivoli, close to the La Scala nightclub. A week before Susanna's disappearance, she had also tried to catch a taxi in the middle of the night to head home after work. And once again, the driver turned out to be strange. He didn't even take her all the way to her home, and during the ride began talking to her in a way that made her uneasy. She became suspicious of his behavior and asked him to stop the car. He refused. So when the car slowed at a traffic light on Place de la Concorde, she jumped out of the vehicle and ran away. The details provided by this woman were almost identical to the circumstances of Susanna's disappearance. It was nearly the same location where Susanna had gone missing. The time of night, and most importantly, the description both women gave: strange taxi. Hearing this testimony, the detectives had little doubt that she was referring to the same man they were searching for. They realized that there was a criminal operating in Paris, abducting women while posing as a taxi driver. They needed to find him, and fast, as panic was starting to spread in the city. People were scared, women tried to travel in groups, and parents were warning their daughters never to get into a taxi alone. Meanwhile, the investigators contacted an officer from the police department who was responsible for combating illegal taxis. They sent him the photo taken at the ATM and informed him that this person might have been picking up clients near the La Scala nightclub on Rue de Rivoli. As soon as the officer saw the photo, he immediately recognized the man. "It's Bruno Cholet," he said confidently. The man had been known to the police for a long time. He was 51 years old, and he had spent half of his life in prison. He started with petty thefts, then moved on to robberies. And at the age of 19, in 1978, he committed his first assault. 5 years later, he was released from prison, but he had not reformed. In January 1983, he picked up a 21-year-old woman who was hitchhiking. Taking a detour, he drove her into the forest. There, threatening her with a weapon, he forced her to undress and give him pleasure. He demanded that she help herself with her hand, and then forced her to lie on her stomach, and having completely undressed, he abused the victim, holding the barrel of a gun to her head and insulting her. After which, he took her scarf and tied her hands behind her back. The rapist left, leaving her completely naked in the forest. In December of the same year, he attacked a 12-year-old girl. After he had abused her, he drove her to the hospital because she had started bleeding. For 2 incidents of violence, he was given 16 years. He was released in 1999 at the age of 42. But what struck the police the most was his modus operandi, or method of operation, meaning the specific way in which a crime is committed by a particular individual. Each time, the attack would begin with the girl getting into the rapist's car alone, hoping he would give her a ride. Instead, he would drive them into the depths of the forest, threatening them with a weapon, tying their hands behind their backs, and taking what he wanted from them. Finally, the most interesting part, Bruno drives a white Ford Galaxy. The Ford Galaxy closely resembles the car that witnesses saw in front of the La Scala Club and at the location where the body was discovered. After studying Bruno Schal's phone, investigators discovered that on the night of Sanna's murder, it had been turned off. The man turned it on around 9 o'clock in the morning near the hotel where he was staying. After obtaining surveillance footage from the hotel's underground parking lot and lobby, they saw that Bruno arrived in his Ford Galaxy, wearing exactly the same clothes as the man who had withdrawn money from Sanna's cards. At that moment, Bruno Schal truly became the prime suspect. He was placed under round-the-clock surveillance. Firstly, because as a repeat offender, he could attack someone else. And secondly, because it was necessary to gather evidence to charge him. On April 25, 2008, officers monitoring the suspect saw him enter a store and buy a shovel. He then drove to the Bois de Boulogne, the Boulogne forest. The man got out of the car and began wandering between the trees, as if searching for something. Finally, the officers saw him kneel by a tree and dig something up. A package. The man brought it to the car and placed it in the trunk. For some reason at that moment, the detectives had no doubt that the suspect had unearthed the murder weapon in the forest. Therefore, the decision was made to arrest him immediately, without giving him a chance to react. When he stopped at a red light, the officers surrounded him and pulled him out of the car. They expected him to resist, but he showed no reaction at all and calmly allowed himself to be arrested, as if everything had been planned. The man was taken to the station and his apartment was searched. The police found the same sweater that was seen on the man in the photo, but Bruno had just picked it up from the dry cleaners, and it was completely clean. The search of the man's car was more fruitful, because in the car they found a small shovel with dirt still clinging to it, latex gloves, and several pairs of handcuffs, like the ones that had been on Suzanne. There was also a gasoline can in the trunk, although Bruno drove a diesel-powered car. This immediately raised the question, why would he need a gasoline can? But the most important discovery was the package in the trunk, which the man had obviously dug up in the forest. Inside this package was another one with the inscription, Suzanne 377. The police never managed to determine the meaning of this mysterious number, and Bruno, of course, refused to explain its significance. But in any case, inside the second package was a small suitcase containing a pistol and a silencer. The caliber of the pistol matched the murder weapon used on Suzanne and was identical to the casings found at the crime scene. As the ballistic examination would soon confirm, this was indeed the gun from which 4 bullets were fired, hitting the girl's head. From the very first moments of the arrest, it became clear that Bruno Schala would be difficult to deal with. He was as unyielding as a stone, completely indifferent and unshaken in front of the investigators conducting the interrogation. However, this was not surprising. He had spent half his life in prison. He was a man who knew investigators, knew how to answer questions, and most importantly, was not afraid. When it came to his actions on the night of the events, he explained that he had been working but did not stop near the nightclub on Rue de Rivoli. They showed him a photo of Sana, hoping that his conscience would stir and that he would react in some way. It was in vain. He answered every question, insisting that he was innocent, and the interrogation had to be stopped. Yes, the detectives didn't get a confession, but there was already a lot of evidence against Bruno. They had found the murder weapon in his possession. A genetic examination of the weapon revealed both Sana's and Bruno's DNA, and a confession from the man wasn't even necessary to be convinced of his guilt. Therefore, the investigating judge immediately brought charges against him for the kidnapping and murder of Sana. Interestingly, after Bruno's arrest, when his photo was shown in newspapers and news programs, 3 more women recognized him and contacted the police. Each of them shared their unpleasant experience with the strange taxi. One of the women was particularly frightened by him. She thought she wouldn't make it out of his car alive. In an act of quick thinking, she managed to pull out a few strands of hair and hide them in his minivan, in case forensic experts would examine it after the violence and possibly her death. Fortunately, she survived and nothing worse happened to her. The trial began on September 4th, 2012. The courtroom was packed as it was a fairly high-profile case. Of course, Sana's family was present at the trial. Many were pleasantly surprised by their behavior. They did not show aggression toward the defendant. They were not like those who come to court with banners and t-shirts with loud slogans. On the contrary, these people were devastated by the death of their daughter, but they did not harbor hatred toward the accused, which is a rare occurrence. The trial provided an opportunity to delve into Bruno Schala's childhood and understand what might have influenced his development into a criminal. He never knew his father, as the man left the family before the birth of his son. When Bruno was a child, his mother gave him up for adoption several times, but later she regretted her decision and had him returned to her. One of the foster families especially welcomed Bruno, and the boy genuinely liked it there. For the first time, someone showed him genuine care and kindness. As Bruno himself admitted, had he stayed with that family, he might have become a worthy member of society. However, social services once again returned him to his biological mother, and he painfully experienced the separation from his foster mother. At the age of 5 or 6, he was placed in an institution for troubled children, where he was strapped into a straitjacket and given medication. His first escape occurred at the age of 7. By the age of 12, he was living on his own and left to fend for himself. At 13, he began selling his body to men. He was 13 and a half years old, slightly drunk, when he was assaulted by 3 men. One of them said, Isn't this little prostitute just beautiful? They tormented and insulted the teenager. If this event truly took place, it could explain why Bruno was completely devoid of the ability to empathize with others. He was examined by several psychiatrists and psychologists. However, they all agreed on one point. Bruno Schall was not mentally ill. He was very dangerous, with a high risk of recidivism. His childhood undoubtedly influenced his development into a criminal. He harbored hatred toward women because they caused him much pain by refusing to love him, with his mother being the first to do so. All these facts might have softened the jury's stance toward the defendant had it not been for his own behavior. On the third or fourth day of the trial, he suddenly wasn't present in the defendant's dock. They couldn't bring him in because, in prison, he had stripped off all of his clothes in protest. This was inappropriate and outrageous, considering the charges against him. They sent guards several times, trying to persuade him to dress and behave appropriately during the trial. In addition, Bruno concocted a conspiracy theory against him, claiming that the investigators had planted the gun. According to him, they wanted him to become an informant in a case about illegal substances. However, when he refused, they decided to take revenge by involving him in a murder case. This was an astonishing statement, though, of course, no one believed him. In doing so, he only turned the jury against him. In reality, Bruno was prepared to fight for his freedom. He knew that if he was found guilty, he would never leave prison. The defendant had thoroughly studied his own case, knew it by heart, and even gave his lawyers hints about details they hadn't noticed. For example, the police hadn't examined tire tracks at the crime scene, which was crucial to the case. Sana's mother took the stand during the trial. She spoke in French, which was not easy for her, so her statement was brief. However, it was incredibly moving. The woman shared with those present how her days had been since her daughter's death. She had stopped sleeping properly. She was prescribed sleeping pills, but she stopped taking them because her dreams were the only place where she could meet her daughter, Sana. The words of this fragile woman seemed to touch even Bruno. At least that's what his lawyer claimed. In her opinion, the man saw in her the loving mother he had dreamed of in his childhood. But even that wasn't enough to melt his cold heart. Looking directly into the eyes of Sana's mother, he said, "Madam, I did not kill your daughter. I didn't even meet her." After 10 days of trial, the court delivered its verdict. Bruno was sentenced to life imprisonment. He could be eligible for parole after 22 years. The man appealed the sentence, but the court upheld the verdict. Bruno died of cancer in 2021 at the age of 65. He smoked 60 cigarettes a day and ended his life the same way he had started, alone. The Zetterberg family founded a foundation named after Suzanne, which helps children from disadvantaged neighborhoods in Paris. This is truly incredible, as they are Swedish and have no direct connection to Paris. However, what happened to Bruno in his childhood may have contributed to the person he became and the reason he attacked Suzanne. This is why the Zetterberg family decided to help the children of Paris, to reduce the likelihood of a tragedy like this repeating itself. They explain that establishing the foundation is not just about charity, but also a way to distance themselves from their anger. Sana's father mourns that his daughter was supposed to return home on May 17, 2008. And she did return, but in a coffin, because of Bruno Schall. But if he were to hate the killer, he would allow him into his home and his life, and would be forced to think about him every day. He doesn't want that. The murderer and rapist had already taken too much from them. That's why Sana's father refuses to feel hatred toward him. Listening to the girl's parents, it becomes clear who Suzanne took after. She was a 19-year-old woman, mature beyond her years, capable of taking responsibility for her actions, thinking clearly, and taking life seriously. Her family wants as many people as possible to remember Suzanne. Since she had a passion for poetry since childhood, after her death, her family published a collection of her poems and stories in both French and Swedish. In addition, the girl's parents and brother planted a beautiful cherry orchard near Montmartre, a place their daughter loved so much. The cherry trees bloom every spring in memory of the prematurely departed Suzanne Zetterberg.
On March 1, 2011, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Gisela Daoud heard her phone ringing. An unknown number appeared on the screen. It was a police officer from the city of Valence, asking if she was the mother of Samira Ben Saad. She answered yes. Gisela couldn't understand why the police were looking for her 20-year-old daughter, Samira. She hadn't seen her for 3 days. The woman demanded an explanation of what was happening. but the police response did not calm her at all. The caller stated that they were searching for Samira because her boyfriend, 22-year-old Mael Combia, had gone missing. The police had discovered that the young couple had been dating for 8 months. However, Gazella knew nothing about the guy. Samira and Mael had met at a party. Samira Ben Saad was a very beautiful woman who was aware of her attractiveness. She wanted to become a model and loved posing for photographs. Mael, in turn, was also a very nice and pleasant young man. There was an immediate mutual attraction between them, and they started seeing each other. However, on February 28, 2011, at 9:45 p.m., Mael's boss from the construction company contacted the police. He was worried because he hadn't heard from his employee for 3 days. On Saturday morning, the guy came to work, and then his phone rang. He quickly got up and left without any explanation, and no one had seen him since. On Monday morning, his boss was surprised that he still hadn't shown up. They considered him a punctual and responsible employee, and it was the first time he didn't come to work. His boss found out that Mael wasn't answering calls from colleagues and friends, so he decided to contact the police. First, the police went to the guy's home in the city center of Valence, but it yielded no results because no one answered the doorbell. His car was not at the house either. On the same evening, the police talked to Mael's mother. She hadn't received any news from her son for 3 days and added that during their last meeting, he had behaved very unusually, being extremely emotional and tense. The woman mentioned that her son hugged and kissed her and said he loved her, something he had never done before. The details uncovered by the investigators seemed very suspicious. Mael and Samira disappeared on the same day without explaining anything to anyone, and had not contacted their families for 3 days. It couldn't be a coincidence. One clue came from examining their phones. The investigators found out that Samira and Mael didn't just leave at the same time, but they left together in Mael's car. The phone pings revealed that on Saturday, in the middle of the day, they headed to Nice, and in the evening, they checked into a luxury hotel on the promenade. The investigators contacted the hotel and learned that there were surveillance cameras capturing 2 guys and a woman. The description perfectly matched Samira and Mael. They left Nice on Sunday morning and arrived in Livorno, 400 kilometers east of the border between France and Italy, by the evening. The young couple was clearly heading further into Italy, and the French police sought assistance from their Italian colleagues. Mael had booked a room in a prestigious hotel in Livorno. The hotel staff confirmed that a guy and a woman matching the description of the missing couple had stayed with them. So, Saturday evening was spent in Nice, and the next day they headed to Livorno. Everything indicated that Samira and Mael had embarked on a spontaneous romantic journey, especially considering that the Riviera was conducive to such adventures. The detectives believed that the young couple would soon return home together, and they had no reason to doubt this theory, especially since Samira's mother received a message from her daughter stating that she had left but there was no need to worry because she would return soon. It seemed like it should have been another confirmation that everything was fine with the young couple, but Gazella was certain that her daughter would never disappear just by impulsively leaving for a trip. Samira was a responsible woman who never missed work. There was another detail that troubled Gazella. She couldn't understand how her daughter, who loved being photographed and never left the house without meticulously applied makeup, styled hair, and carefully chosen clothes, could go away for several days with a young man without taking any belongings with her. She was also puzzled by the fact that Samira sent an SMS. The thing is, she would usually just call her mother. They were close and could talk for hours, so receiving a text message didn't calm her down. Instead, it only worried her even more. The next news about the case came from the city of Imperia, located in northern Italy, approximately 80 kilometers from Nice. On Monday, March 3, 2011, Massimo Bessone was on his way to work when he turned onto a small street to take a shortcut. Along the road, he noticed something strange. At first, he thought he saw a mannequin, but when he opened the door, he realized it was a woman. Massimo shouted something but received no response. However, the woman was clearly moving. He quickly called for an ambulance. Italian police determined that she was the missing French woman. Someone had shot her in the back of the head, and the bullet had lodged in her skull. The theory of a romantic trip could now be discarded. The French police were perplexed. Initially, it was a case of suspicious disappearance, then they thought it was a love-related escape, but now they were dealing with a girl who had been wounded in an attempted murder. Samira was alive but in critical condition. She was immediately taken to the hospital, and her mother was informed. When Gazella arrived at the hospital, she didn't even recognize her own daughter at first. It's difficult to describe the sight. Samira's head was shaved bald, and she resembled a 9-year-old child. The woman refused to believe that her daughter ended up in Italy with a bullet in her head. The doctors told the mother that there was little hope since the bullet was lodged in her daughter's skull. But Gazella didn't want to accept that and arranged for Samira to be transported to a hospital in Marseille. There, a surgeon informed her directly that he would perform the operation but wouldn't provide false hope. Even if the patient survived, she would never fully recover. Samira underwent a 10-hour operation. Although she made it through the surgery, when she opened her eyes, she didn't recognize anyone and couldn't speak. She had to relearn everything like a young child. While Samira couldn't tell anything about what happened in Italy, the police had to search for the culprit without her testimony. Many indications pointed to the crime being planned. She was found lying on the side of the road near a landfill, and the Italian police couldn't find any of her belongings. There was no purse, no phone, no passport. This indicated that the perpetrator wanted her to remain unidentified. However, the investigators had a lead. The last person Samira was seen with was her boyfriend, Mael Combia. The police believed that Mael crossed the border into Italy to commit the crime and then fled. However, he made a mistake by using his bank card in France after Samira was found. He used it at a first-class hotel in Les Tourettes, just 35 kilometers from his apartment in Valence. Surveillance cameras showed that Mael had returned to France a day earlier. But if he was innocent, why didn't he go home to his family? Instead, he stayed in a hotel just a few kilometers away. Soon, he made another mistake. Investigators discovered that he had used Samira's credit card. In other words, the young couple embarked on a spontaneous trip to another country, where the woman nearly died, and Mael stayed in a hotel and used her card. Everything confirmed the police's worst suspicions. To search for a motive, the detective spoke with the family and friends of the young man. It became clear that Samira and Mael's relationship was far from perfect. Samira was a very beautiful woman, and many men showed interest in her, which bothered Mael. Their arguments often escalated into physical violence. Mael could slap Samira in front of their friends, and there was even an incident where he extinguished a cigarette on her. Obviously, he couldn't be considered a very stable person. But the question of the motive remained open. Did Mael act in a fit of rage, or was everything planned in advance? All their friends knew that Samira was infatuated with Mael despite his behavior. However, she recently found out that her boyfriend was married. He had gotten married to his girlfriend at the age of 18, and frequently cheated on her. Samira was far from being his only mistress. She was angered by the revelation but didn't break up with him because she believed Mael's claim that they were in the process of divorce and living separately. Upon discovering this, the investigator went to Mael's home. But as soon as he entered, he realized that Samira was mistaken, and the husband and wife were clearly living together. Furthermore, Mael was soon to become a father. The apartment had 17 ultrasound photos with the name Combia written on them. It was evident that Mael, his wife, and Samira were involved in a love triangle, and one of them was destined to disappear. It was necessary to find Mael, and it turned out to be much easier than the police had anticipated. Mael Combia surrendered himself 5 days after the disappearance, appearing at the Valence police station on March 4. This was an incredible stroke of luck for the investigation. Mael not only came to the station voluntarily but also directly confessed that he was the one who shot Samira. He then proceeded to recount what had happened. The young man claimed that Samira was just an acquaintance with whom he could spend pleasant time. Their relationship had no future, and she knew it. Mael explained that their romance had come to an end, but Samira couldn't accept it. She didn't give him a moment's peace, constantly calling him and sometimes dialing his number 150 times in a single day. He showed the investigator his phone, which displayed evidence that Samira had called him approximately 1,000 times in a month. Mael's words confirmed that Samira's behavior could be classified as stalking. But could this be considered a justification for shooting her? Soon, the situation escalated to the point where the young man feared for his life. He recounted what happened on the Friday evening before their departure to Italy. Samira confronted him in a nightclub while he was kissing another woman. She stormed out of the club, scratched his car with her key, and they began arguing, which escalated into a fight with Samira's cousins. This incident terrified Mael because they claimed to have weapons and threatened to kill him. Mael was in a panic. He quickly got into his car and left the nightclub, deciding that he needed to come up with a way to protect himself in the future. The idea of acquiring a weapon for his own defense crossed his mind. The next day, when he received a call, he impulsively left and went to buy a revolver. However, all of this still didn't explain why he shot Samira. Mael explained that he didn't go to Italy to kill her or commit any other terrible act. He simply wanted to put an end to their troubled relationship. He drove Samira to Italy to calm down their heated emotions and explain everything to her. But things didn't go as planned. They argued again in the car, and Mael got out. Samira followed him. According to Mael, he grabbed the weapon with the intention of scaring her but had no intention to shoot. However, the revolver went off accidentally. Afterward, he left her lying on the ground, got back into the car, and drove away. When asked why he didn't call for an ambulance, he said he was scared when she fell. He went into hiding for several days because he didn't know what to do. The rest of the story was already known to the police. Overall, the man claims that he was the victim of his obsessive lover's pursuit, and what happened in Italy was an accident. He was arrested for attempted murder, but his explanation didn't fully convince the police. Some pieces didn't fit together. Why would someone travel to another country and stay in a luxury hotel just to end a relationship? Why did he take all her personal belongings and then use her credit card? And who sent the message to Samira's mother from her daughter's phone? The investigator had no doubt that the young man was lying, but it was difficult to prove without Samira's testimony. Fortunately, over time and with therapy, Samira was able to provide her testimony. At first, with a weak voice and very slowly, Samira began to speak. On October 11, 2011, 8 months after the attack, she recounted her version of events. Samira's words contradicted the claims of her former lover. He came to her home, stating that they needed to talk. She didn't want to, but he insisted, so she relented. Mael invited her for a weekend getaway. She asked where he wanted to go, and he replied, Spain. This didn't sit well with her, so he took her to Nice instead, and from there, they went to Italy. After 2 days of leisure, on the third day of the trip, Mael unexpectedly veered off the road. When asked why he turned onto a road leading to a landfill, he reassured her not to worry because he simply needed to dispose of something. Mael stopped the car and got out. He opened the passenger side door for her to exit and retrieved a revolver. Pointing it at her, he declared that she would die. "Shoot if you're a man," she exclaimed. And he fired the gun. On February 7, 2012, a year after the attack on Samira, forensic experts found the revolver, and this discovery completely refuted Mael's claims. According to his version, the gun in his hand unexpectedly went off. However, ballistic analysis showed that such an event could not have occurred. The expert explained that before firing, the shooter needs to carefully prepare, pull the trigger back and then shoot, which involves 2 distinct actions. You cannot simply wave your hand for the revolver to fire. Furthermore, to pull the trigger of the revolver backward, one needs to hold the weapon with one hand and apply significant force to accomplish the action with the other hand. Accidentally firing such a firearm was utterly impossible. Mael Combia lied. He wanted to kill Samira, and after several months of investigation, detectives were able to reconstruct the plan that the murderer had conceived. On February 26, 2011, at 9 a.m., Mael left work. He was determined to avoid a repeat of the previous night's scene at all costs, so he purchased a weapon. Heading to the woods, he tested it, loaded it, pulled the trigger, and fired. He had planned everything. After a romantic weekend in Italy, Samira was supposed to disappear on the other side of the border. Italy served as the perfect country to commit the crime since he had no connections there. Driving off the road, Mael pulled the woman out of the car, declared he would kill her, and shot her. Then he took her belongings to prevent her identification. Returning to France, Mael attempted to mislead the police by sending an SMS to Samira's mother. Everyone was supposed to believe that the woman had gone on a trip and was still alive. The guy believed he had committed the perfect crime and was confident that he would never be caught. Imagine his surprise when he discovered that his victim had survived. While the police were searching for him, he spent 5 days hiding near his hometown, contemplating his next actions. He lacked the means and useful connections to escape, so he devised a new strategy for self-defense. Mael Combia decided to go to the police and present his version of events. On February 10, 2014, the trial of Mael began in the city of Valence. The trial was a real ordeal for the victim and her family. To their immense surprise, Mael did not deviate from his version of events. He insisted that he was the victim in this case, and Samira had been harassing him, and everything that happened in Italy was an unfortunate accident. His friends stated that he had never been an aggressive person and purchased the revolver out of fear after threats from Samira's cousins, who had threatened to destroy his apartment, car, and kill Mael himself. He hid nothing and went on a trip to Italy in his own car, taking his phone with him. He simply wanted to take the woman on a trip to calm her down, as he was emotionally exhausted from Samira's constant call. It is also worth noting that Mael conducted himself with exaggerated politeness and respect during the trial, effortlessly charming the jury. And his strategy paid off. He was sentenced to 13 years of imprisonment. The lenient sentence made many wonder if there was a connection between Mael's behavior in court and the relatively short duration of the sentence chosen by the jury. After all, people often associate criminals with unpleasant personalities, and it is difficult for them to convict a charming young man with excellent manners. Samira considers this punishment too lenient, as by the time he turns 40, he will be a free man, able to live a normal life, while she will forever remain bound to a wheelchair simply because she loved a man who decided to kill her. The surgeon explained that during 1 year of therapy, Samira regained 80% of her abilities, after which the effectiveness of rehabilitation sharply declined, leaving her dependent on the help of others for the rest of her life. She admits that she was willing to do anything for love, and this is how he repaid her.
In this eerie, shocking, and unjust story that took place in the small American city of Fitchburg, Wisconsin, winter, so characteristic of this region, played a significant role. Wrapping everything in soft white snow on the eve of the winter holidays, it could just as easily turn cold, icy, frosty, windy, and fierce. Black ice on the roads, prolonged power outages, blizzards, snowstorms, and heavy snowfall. Winter in Fitchburg is the real thing. At times, an imposing layer of snow would completely paralyze the roads, and schools would close. The winter of December 2005 was no exception. 25-year-old Angela Nicole Drake grew up in Wisconsin and was not afraid of the cold. December, with its traditional decorated Christmas trees, snowfall, and pre-holiday bustle, was her favorite time of year. So on Thursday, December 8th, despite the surprisingly frigid weather and about 10 centimeters of snow, Angela, or Angie, didn't stay home but decided to spend the evening enjoying herself. The thing was, Angie was a nurse who worked with children with special needs. She was a wonderful nurse, getting along beautifully with the kids and able to connect even with those whom other nurses struggled to reach. The children adored her, but it was clearly an exhausting job, both physically and emotionally. That's why Angie needed those rare but meaningful moments of rest. So on December 8th, after work, she met up with her close friend Rachel, and the two happily headed to their favorite karaoke bar, the Dry Bean Saloon and Steakhouse. From there, they planned to go to Rachel's place, which was literally a 5-minute walk from the bar. They intended to spend the night, and in the morning, when both had to go to work, Rachel would drop her friend off at her car, which Angie had left near the bar. The friends had done this a million times before, and this time was supposed to be no exception. Outside, the bitter cold raged, but inside the bar it was warm, crowded, and decorated for Christmas and New Year's. Angie and Rachel felt at home there, ran into many acquaintances, and had a wonderful time. Angie, who had a beautiful voice, as always sang her favorite song by Janis Joplin, "Piece of My Heart." Overall, it was a pleasant but ordinary evening, until one moment. Rachel and Angie always left together, but this time Angie decided to stay at the bar a little longer, and Rachel went home alone at around 11:30 p.m. Rachel promised to leave her apartment door unlocked for her friend and headed home. She was sure that Angela would be perfectly fine because they felt at home in that karaoke bar. They knew all the staff and many of the patrons, which meant they were among friends there, even if they hadn't arrived with them. Besides, Angie had only had a small amount of alcohol, and it would be no trouble for her to walk the 5 minutes to Rachel's apartment. However, when Rachel woke up in the morning, she discovered that the apartment door was still unlocked, and there were no signs that her friend had come by and already left for work. In other words, she had not shown up at Rachel's place at all during the night. At first, Rachel wasn't worried. After all, nothing prevented Angie from going to her own home. Fortunately, she lived only about 20 minutes from the karaoke bar. The only thing that troubled Rachel was that her friend hadn't texted or warned her not to wait up. But when, a couple of hours later, she tried calling Angie and the phone went straight to voicemail, Rachel decided that this was already strange. She called Angela's father, with whom the young woman was living at the time, and asked whether his daughter had returned home. It turned out that Angela was neither at home nor at work, because her colleagues had also just begun looking for her. None of her friends or acquaintances had heard anything from her. All of this was unusual, but it is worth emphasizing that she was a 25-year-old independent woman, so her family did not rush to panic. However, when evening came and there was still no news, Angie's loved ones thought to check the parking lot of the karaoke bar. They found Angela's car in the same spot where she had left it. It was covered in snow, and it was clear that the vehicle had been sitting there for nearly a full day. Her family knew that the bar had been warm, so Angie had gone there wearing only a red sweater, a warm vest, jeans, and boots. Fearing that she might have slipped on the way to her friend's home, hit her head, and be lying somewhere in such light clothing, her relatives walked the route from the bar to Rachel's house, but they found no one and nothing. By the evening of the following day, Angie's father called the police. As the second day since the young woman's disappearance was already underway, officers immediately got to work. First, they spoke with Rachel. She told the police that when she left her friend at the karaoke bar, Angie had not been alone but with a young man. Tall, tanned, fair-haired, and blue-eyed, the man was very attractive. Angie introduced her new acquaintance as Oliver. He was clearly her type, so Rachel wasn't surprised when her friend said she didn't want to leave yet. Rachel didn't insist and went home, assuming her friend knew best what she was doing. The officers hurried to ask the bar staff whether they had seen Angela and whether they knew this Oliver. They recalled seeing the young woman but could offer little else. In their memory, the days had blurred together, and they couldn't say exactly who did what that evening. Fortunately, investigators could see for themselves. The establishment had several surveillance cameras recording the premises from different angles. After reviewing the footage, investigators saw a blonde woman in a bright red sweater and an attractive young man, evidently Oliver. Rachel confirmed that it was him. Unfortunately, the cameras did not cover every corner of the establishment and did not capture how the young people interacted at the bar. However, one camera did record Angie leaving the venue at exactly 1:30 a.m. Angela looked happy. She almost seemed to be dancing as she walked. She was not leaving alone, but in the company of two men and another woman. As they exited, one of the men reached out and took Angie's hand. Detectives believed this was Oliver. Since none of Angie's family or friends recognized Oliver or his companions, the police turned to the public. They released Oliver's photo to the media, hoping that someone would recognize him, and they got incredibly lucky, because Oliver himself contacted the police. He readily confirmed Rachel's account and explained that he and Angie had been talking for about an hour. But when he briefly turned his attention to his friends, Angie had already moved on, chatting cheerfully with another young man. Then they went to play pool, and Oliver didn't see them again. Investigators showed the witness the footage of Angie leaving the bar with a young man, but Oliver was quick to assure them that it wasn't him. He had left with his friends. After Oliver's friends all confirmed in unison that he had gone with them, detectives went back to the footage, studying it frame by frame. The image quality was poor, but it appeared that Angie had indeed left with someone else. This mysterious young man was taller, dark-haired, and most importantly, wearing a jacket with a distinctive emblem on the chest, something that could potentially be identified. The police again turned to the public for help, but this time they didn't release a blurred image of the dark-haired stranger's face. Instead, they focused on the emblem on his jacket. They also tried reviewing footage from other street cameras, but there was little hope there. First, such cameras are usually aimed at a business's own entrance or parking lot. Second, during the heavy snowfall that night, very little could be clearly seen on video. Meanwhile, Angie's family couldn't sit idly by. They wanted to help the police spread the word about her disappearance as widely as possible. They used the tools available in 2005. Angie's mother and stepfather wrote an email describing her, what she was wearing, and attached a photo, marking it missing, and sent it to everyone in their email contact list, asking recipients to forward it. Fortunately, the plan worked, and within a few days, thousands of people had received the message. Among them was 23-year-old Tom Allen. Tom went to the police station and explained that that evening he had been at the karaoke bar with his roommates Marcy, Shane, and Michael DeSalvo, as well as a friend visiting from another city, Peter. Marcy met Angie at the bar and introduced her to the rest of the group. Since Angie's friend Rachel had already gone home by that time, Tom assumed the young woman was there alone, without friends. He also noticed that she had consumed quite a bit of alcohol. Angie joined their group, and they played pool together. Around 1:30 a.m., they left the karaoke bar, as recorded by the surveillance camera. Following Angie, Mike came out of the bar, wearing the jacket with the emblem. It was a work jacket issued to him by his employer, a company providing septic tank cleaning services. Tom said they left the karaoke bar to go to another nearby bar called Monkey Shines. They split between two cars. Tom and Peter got into Tom's car and drove ahead, while Marcy, Shane, Mike, and Angie were supposed to follow. But when Marcy and Shane arrived at the bar, they reported that Mike and Angie had dropped them off and left. The friends assumed that Mike had been concerned about Angie's condition and had driven her home. Their surprise was great when they later discovered Angie in their apartment. She was lying on Mike's bed, apparently having fallen asleep from drinking too much. Mike was in the process of taking her boots off. Shane and Tom discussed whether they should intervene. The issue was that Mike had only recently moved in with them, and they didn't know him well enough to be sure he wouldn't take advantage of Angie's defenseless state. They didn't want to leave her alone behind a closed door. They considered knocking on Mike's door and offering to move Angie into one of their rooms, with one of the guys sleeping on the living room couch. Tom even remarked that if it had been his sister, he would have wanted someone to take care of her. Yet for some reason, Tom and Shane deliberated and did nothing. They went to sleep, and by around 9 a.m., Angie was no longer in the apartment. Mike briefly explained that he had driven her wherever she had asked to go. Later, the guys asked Mike whether he had been intimate with Angie. He told one of them yes, and the other no. This was odd, but the friends got caught up in their own lives and problems, and nobody thought about Angie again until Tom saw her photo in the forwarded email. The investigators quickly spoke with 24-year-old Michael DeSalvo. He readily confirmed that he had been at the karaoke bar that evening with his roommates. Angie had joined them and even wanted to go with them to another bar, but Mike decided it would be better for her to rest. According to him, she fell asleep in the car, and he carried her into his home. He put her to bed so she could recover and tell him where she wanted to be taken. She stayed at his house until 5 a.m. Mike had to wake her because he needed to go to work and also give her a ride home. Angie told him where to go, and he drove her to a private house about 15 minutes south of his apartment. He didn't wait for her to go inside. He just waved goodbye and left for work. He never saw or heard from her again, and they didn't exchange phone numbers. When investigators asked if he had had any sexual contact with Angie, he said he didn't remember. The investigators wanted to believe Mike, especially since his story matched what his roommates had told them, and Angie's home was indeed about 15 minutes south of his apartment. But if his account was true, something must have happened to Angie literally at her front door, which was hard to believe. Investigators also checked the backgrounds of all the young people who had interacted with Angie that night and found that only 24-year-old Mike DeSalvo had prior police encounters. He came from Minnesota, where he lived in a fairly upscale area, but in a very frugal household. Since he didn't have expensive possessions, cars, or vacations at the world's best resorts, his peers often mocked him. When he got tired of this, Mike fell in with a bad crowd and began doing reckless things, such as allegedly stealing a car from a dealership under the pretense of a test drive. He committed thefts and experimented with illicit substances. However, his offenses did not go beyond that, and he had never attacked women. Nevertheless, investigators obtained a search warrant for Mike's room, his work van, and his personal car. In the van, under the passenger seat, officers found Angie's phone. While this could potentially be explained without malicious intent, the next discoveries were far harder to justify. In the trunk of his personal car, they found a bag containing Angie's boots, underwear, jeans, and belt. So what does that mean? Had he been driving her around in the cold while she was barely dressed? Or had she changed into his clothes for some reason? That scenario wasn't entirely impossible. If Angie had felt ill, vomited, and soiled her own clothes, she might have needed to change. But what compelled Mike to burn her identification? Yes, exactly. The police found a charred ID in a trash bag near his house, and there was soot on his shoes, suggesting he had recently been near a fire. The detectives decided they had to prepare for the worst and begin searching for Angie's body. Since Mike had only a few hours before his roommates woke up, he wouldn't have had time to bury her, especially in such cold, damp weather when the ground at the surface was as hard as stone. He could only have hidden the body somewhere, under a bridge, in a roadside ditch, or a similar spot. Officers divided the city into sections and began systematically searching each one. They deployed helicopters hoping that Angie's red sweater would be visible from the air. They combed wooded areas, nature trails, and lakes, but the entire city was blanketed in snow, making the task significantly more difficult. On December 22nd, around noon, while one of the officers was surveying the area between Mike's house and Angie's home, he noticed a small, inconspicuous bridge. It spanned a steel tunnel through which, in warmer months, a tiny stream ran. Guardrails had been installed on both sides of the road to prevent anyone from accidentally slipping down. The officer looked over one side of the guardrail and saw nothing. He glanced at the other side, still saw nothing, but decided to go down anyway. Later, he admitted that as he approached, he already had a premonition that he would find Angie, as if something was pushing him to search there. On one side of the tunnel, he saw nothing. The cold was biting, but he couldn't leave without checking the other side. There, he leaned over, shone his flashlight, and noticed a strand of light-colored hair. Even before official identification, it was clear to everyone that the body belonged to Angela Nicole Drake. She was dressed only in a red sweater and socks. Nearby lay the warm vest she had worn the day she disappeared. There were no obvious wounds or injuries. It appeared as though she had fallen asleep, seeking shelter from the cold in the tunnel. Leaves clung to her body, and beneath her, the snow had melted. She was lying face down, her arms pressed to her torso, fists clenched, and dirt in her hands. The medical examiner who arrived at the scene could tell even without an autopsy that she had been holding her hands to her chest to keep warm, suffering from the cold. This meant that she had been alive while lying in that icy tunnel. The autopsy confirmed the preliminary findings of the medical examiner. Angie had been left in the tunnel, where she died in agony from the cold. The pathologist also determined that she had engaged in sexual contact before her death. However, there was one detail he could not state with complete certainty. He found signs of asphyxiation but could not definitively say what caused it. Either a pillow had been placed over her face in an attempt to suffocate her, or she had vomited and inhaled the contents. obstructing her airway. The latter theory was supported by blood traces on the mattress in Mike DeSalvo's room and evidence of aspiration in her lungs. Aspiration occurs when food or liquid enters the respiratory tract instead of the esophagus. In other words, it was possible that no one intentionally tried to suffocate her, and the asphyxiation happened accidentally. But in any case, asphyxiation was not the cause of death. Angie died from hypothermia, extreme cold, because she was left nearly naked in a tunnel at -15 degrees Celsius. Whoever left her there alone, unclothed and intoxicated, had condemned her to almost certain death. The detectives hypothesized that the events of that night unfolded as follows. Mike brought Angie to his home and carried her inside. She had obviously consumed too much alcohol to give meaningful consent, and he took advantage of her vulnerable state. From there, two scenarios were possible. Either she regained consciousness, tried to resist, and threatened to call the police, forcing Mike to act, perhaps attempting to suffocate her by placing a pillow over her face, or she became sick and vomited, making it impossible for her to breathe, and Mike assumed she had died. In either case, he placed her in his car and drove her to the tunnel, leaving her there, believing she was lifeless. Angie regained consciousness in that terrifying dark tunnel. In -15-degree temperatures, nearly unclothed, she froze rapidly. Hypothermia prevented her from standing, moving onto the road, or attracting attention. All she could do was press her arms against her body, trying to preserve the little warmth she had left. She was alone, terrified, aware that she was dying, but utterly powerless. She died in excruciating agony. How could a normal evening at a karaoke bar turn into something so unimaginably horrific? And yet, Angie had loved the winters in her native Wisconsin so much. But it wasn't only winter that killed her. The weight of guilt rested on the person she had met that evening. However, proving it in court would not be easy. Although Mike DeSalvo was initially charged with first-degree murder, the prosecution had to prove not only that his actions led to Angie's death, but also that he had intended to kill her, and that was much harder. After all, he could simply claim that he woke up and found her lying unconscious, assumed she was dead, panicked, especially given his criminal history, and disposed of the body. The prosecution had heard that story 1,000 times and knew their chances of winning were slim. As a result, there was no trial. Mike DeSalvo was offered a plea deal, which he accepted. He was charged with first-degree negligent homicide, for which he will serve 25 years in prison. This means he could be released as early as 2031.